They get to Gethsemane. My apologies, we're doing this at such speed, but you're kind of getting the flow. So Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, which actually means the olive press. So there's a kind of a sense of foreboding and squeezing in. So Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place. So he's obviously found out earlier on in the meal that they're going to finish at Gethsemane, which is on the Mount of Olives, but as a walled garden, as a kind of a closed garden, a working garden, that most of the pilgrims are sleeping outside of it. So it gives them some privacy. It'll be a walled area. It will probably have some small buildings in it, which are to do with pressing of the olives and so on. So when he was at the place, he said to his disciples, "Sit while I go and pray that you don't enter into temptation." So he asked them to pray, and he withdraws just a stone's throw. Peter, James and John are closest. He kneels down to pray. He's sorrowful, but then, of course, as we know the story, he's in kind of real prayer agony. He's asking if the hour might pass from him without having to go through it. If it's possible, things are possible to you, but please remove the cup. Let it pass away from me. Nevertheless, it's not what I will, but not my desire, but your desire, your will that gets done. So you have this kind of inner thing, which is, I really don't want this, but I am going to be faithful. And you can see the struggle, or you read the struggle. We know about how as he keeps coming back, of course, the disciples are falling asleep while he's going through this intense prayer time. So eventually then an angel appears to him to strengthen him as he goes through this intercessionary period. Being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. And in that context, while the angel is there, his blood becomes like his sweat becomes drops of blood. Which is one of those really lovely moments, because in the ancient world, if you've never seen hematidrosis, you wouldn't believe it happen. In fact, almost nobody's seen it happen, but it does happen. As I say, it's a particular phenomena, sweating of blood. It's extremely rare, but it is now well documented. It's when you're under incredible stress, and the pressure in the muscles actually kind of bursts the capillaries in the sweat glands, and blood leaks into the sweat glands. So you get a mixing of blood and sweat. It can happen in various places, not just the face, but most common around the eyes. That's the kind of the places. So even Wikipedia, I say it tells us, I took this copy a few years ago, so you never know what it says nowadays, but when I was doing this slide, first of all, I found this little phrase. It says, the New Testament indicates that Jesus underwent hematidrosis before the crucifixion of Jesus during the agony of the garden. And it goes on to say these claims are plausible because actually, of course, that is the kind of thing. It's under those extreme stresses that these things happen. It's actually one of the things where it's been studied is in people who are awaiting execution, who often experience this phenomena. So again, there's a little touch of one, the historical authenticity of the account, but equally, actually, it gives us more of an insight into actually the physiological, psychological impact of what Jesus is doing. He's not kind of breezing through it in a kind of ethereal way because he's so heavenly minded. He feels none of the pressures of earth. He's willingly taking on, not because it's something he would want to do, but because actually there's something in the way he lives that has to submit himself, not for his own pleasure, but actually for his own pain and suffering, but to the will of something bigger. We won't go too much into the theological reasons for that or the whatever, but it is profoundly there at the heart of a Christian faith. Sometimes it is lost in modern Christianity, where it's kind of almost that God has become cosmic Santa and everything's going to be happy and easy for us. It is a happy, meaningful life, but there are times when actually the pursuit of it, in the way that God has put together the life that we have, does require us to take on the pressures in a way that it's not appropriate for God to remove them for us. And Jesus is willing to live through that. He won't ask us to go through anything he hasn't himself. So we kind of think the meanwhile, his Judas with Malchus, they've been up at the temple. So they go up and they also pick up from the fort of Antonia a large number of Roman soldiers. The traditional model of the fort of Antonia is too small for a whole cohort. That doesn't mean to say it's wrong, because the cohort's normally based over at Caesarea Maritima on the coast. So it's probably a contingent from the cohort. If it's the bigger model that we looked at, you could even accommodate the whole cohort there. But whatever reason, they go and pick up soldiers from there. And there's a lot in the cohort, but remember, they're going to arrest Jesus on the Mount of Olives. He's in a garden. It will be away from the view of the public. But if they jump over the wall, there are in hundreds of thousands of pilgrims there. They could easily disappear in. So you need a reasonable contingent to make sure you've got them totally surrounded. And so Judas moves down to find Jesus in the garden. So Jesus comes forward to identify himself. Knowing all things and what were happening, he went forth. He said to them, "Who are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus said, "I am he." and the Hebrew form of the phrase there, the Greek form of the phrase there, is it says, I am, which is the way the Septuagint translates when God says, I am. I am he, says Jesus, which we find regularly in John's Gospel. Jesus expressing himself using a kind of a model of the divine name, I am. And at that point, he says, because it notes, when therefore he said, I am, and forget the word he, it's not there, I am, they went backwards, and fell to the ground. And there's a kind of a wonderful sort of, if you like, epiphanic moment. That's kind of moment of revelation as Jesus kind of uses that phrase, I am, and something of in the spirit of the truth of who he is revealed. They stagger backwards and fall to the ground just for a moment. Just for a moment, because it's not a kind of an escape plan. It's just actually something peeking through and into history. And then we kind of read how now Judas steps forward. Judas was called one of the 12, was leading them. And so he steps forward, comes near to kiss Jesus, says, "Hail, Rabbi." Jesus says, "Jesus, friend, why are you here? Do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" Again, therefore, he, i.e. Jesus, asked them, "Who are you looking for?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." So it's that after the initial moment, they've fallen back, but now they're regrouping, they're getting things together. Judas is taking a lead. He asks them, if you seek me, let these others who are with me go their way. The word might be fulfilled, of those whom you have given me, I have not lost any of them. So Jesus is thinking about his disciples. At that point, Peter steps forwards and strikes Malchus. So just as Jesus is being seized, Peter steps forward. They came and laid hands on Jesus and took him. When those who were around him saw what was about to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with a sword?" And a certain one of those who was with Jesus, Simon Peter, having a sword, stretched out his hand, drew his sword, struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And the servant's name was Malchus. So we see probably he's been picked up from early in the evening when Judas first leaves, goes up to the priestly house, picks up the steward, takes him with him, picks up the temple guard, goes and get the Roman soldiers. They're adding kind of layers of authority to capture Jesus. And of course, Jesus steps forward and says, "Let me do this." He touches his ear and heals him. So there's Peter, and off goes Malchus. Jesus says to Peter, "Put the sword back in its place. For everyone who takes up the sword will die by the sword." Again, you notice the colours are changing. I'm turning everything into one dialogue. "The cup which the Father has given me, surely I shall drink it. Or do you think I couldn't ask my Father, and he even now send me 12 more legions of angels? How then would the scripture be filled that it must be so?" And I love this little verse which comes from Matthew's Gospel, because we've read how Jesus has said, "I don't want to do this, Lord. I don't want to do this, Father. Please take it. Is there any way I can avoid this? But not my will, but yours." So we have seen, if you like, a sense of freedom in the way that Jesus is praying. But here what we find is it really is a choice. That what Jesus is saying, it's in his words. If don't you think I could have asked my Father and he would have sent 12 legions of angels? In other words, at that moment, although it kind of is mind-blowing to us because we understand how history revolves around the crucifixion, that all of history hangs on this moment, as he's unpacked in the Last Supper with his disciples, how when Thaddeus or Jude the Obscure has said, "Why us, why now?" And he's kind of highlighted how there's something changing in the whole spiritual nature of the world because of what he's going through. And in this context, we think, well, it must have had to happen. It couldn't have happened any other way. But what he's saying is it's been done by mutual consent on both sides. The Father has asked something which he sees is needed. I have submitted myself in my humanity to the will of what he sees, even though I can't see it. And yet, if I had not freely chosen to do that, and if I had asked and said, please send 12 legions of angels, he would have done it. So there's no point you trying to do this, Peter, because I've already gone through this process, and I'm freely going into this moment. I'm going in absolutely free by my own volition. And that's absolutely fundamental, and it has to be done this way. And obviously that would be a whole other Lent course in its own way. Why does it have to be done that way? But we kind of learn these things as we go. So look, I just noticed I'm blocking the text, so I'll just get rid of the text there. So in that hour, Jesus said to them, the multitudes, i.e. the chief priests, captains of the temple, and elders who had come against him. So it seems that some senior priests there as well. If you come out against me as a robber with swords and clubs to seize me, I sat daily within the temple teaching, and you didn't arrest me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness. All this has happened so that the scriptures and the prophets might be fulfilled. And then all the disciples left him and fled. I'm going to put myself back on. So actually, here we go, a little animating of it. They all ran away. Now, that might look random, but there's some logic to it. Jesus is arrested. It seems, we're going to see, that 8 of them head towards Bethany, because we're going to meet them there at another point later on. Thomas goes further afield because he's not there at Bethany. So if I go back, Bethany is over to... if you take this path here, remember, we kind of followed it out. Bethany is in this direction. They're out here on the Mount of Olives. They're not going to go in because the temple is here and the fort is here. Jesus is being taken this way. Therefore, they can either go south or they can go east. It looks like Thomas, therefore, goes south and most of them head east. Because we're eventually going to find most of them in Bethany, but Thomas is going to be missing. But Peter and John actually turn around and start to follow back in towards the city to see what's going to happen to Jesus. So they seized him and led him away. Jesus brought him to the high priest's house, but Peter followed from a distance, and a certain young man followed him. Oh yeah, sorry. There's a young man. Now we don't know who the young man is. Well, but tradition tells us it's John Mark, whose family owns the house where the Last Supper was. Well, what's he doing in the Garden of Gethsemane? Well, it may well be that actually he's been put out of the house and he's sleeping in one of the working buildings there. So there's a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around himself. So he's presumably, it just means he's sleeping at this point. So he gets up, he's just kind of wrapped in his cloth. And as he's following them, the young men, i.e. the soldiers, grab him, and the linen cloth gets dragged off him. And so he flies away naked. There we go. We have my little streaker as he goes over. So they led him away and brought him to the high priest's house. And those who had taken Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, where all the chief priests and the scribes were gathered. Well, they're not there to start with, but we're going to read about how they gather. But Peter had followed him from a distance until he came to the court of the high priest and entered it. He was sitting with the officers and warming himself in the light of the fire to see everything to the end. So I'm going to put here, this is nearly there now. When they first get there in the dark, we're going to start an interrogation process before the main trial. So this is what we might think of as the discovery process. It's not the trial proper, but that's actually where we're going to be leaving it tonight. So there were lots of things we weren't able to touch on because there was an awful lot of teaching that Jesus gives. But I hope you see there's a kind of you see the very kind of human levels of the different people interacting and actually the genuineness of the betrayal. Part of one of the things I think we often miss is we kind of say rather glibly, Jesus died for the sins of the whole world and he carries the consequences and so on. But actually, at a very human level, how utterly every kind of, if you like, aspect of what makes life good. He's betrayed by a close friend. His other friends who should be supportive run away, even though he wants them to for their own safety, but they all run away. His own countrymen, as we've seen in the week running, every different faction, and seems to be kind of antagonistic towards him. And yet all he's tried to do for them is to be blessing and to show them freedom and show them release and healing the sick, but then they're complaining because he's doing it on the wrong days. And so you can see, if you like, at the human level, how grinding down it is, and actually that seems to be part of what makes the story so powerful as an exemplar, and why, as we say, we follow Jesus. We try to follow his example, that no matter how we get betrayed, mistreated, abused, going through this incredibly painful form of torture that the Romans have invented over the next couple of days, we're going to see, standing in a trial judge, with a trial judge who's so utterly corrupt, he even throws away the statement, "What's truth? What's truth then?" And then he gives in to the pressure of those with their political means. Everything is wrong about what happens. And yet through this, by raising him up, this is where we're going to, of course, finish at the end of Easter, raising him up as an example, God is kind of saying, this is what I recognize as being the life that I would choose. It's the life that is somehow able to live with this, and yet to go on loving and honouring in that kind of context. So we're not fully there with all the bits, but hopefully as we're doing these weeks, you can see how the layers are working, about the huge levels of disappointment that at a human level have to be faced, the levels of betrayal, the levels of letdown, and so on and so forth. But anyway, let's not run over unnecessarily. So would anyone like to ask anything or just clarify anything during this stage? You can turn your microphones on now if you want to ask a question. Or
that was fascinating, Kristen. Thank you. So are you saying then that the room where the Last Supper was held,
yeah,
was the same room, was the upper room where the Holy Spirit?
That has always been the consistent Christian tradition on it. I mean, in both Catholic and Orthodox, it becomes a kind of key room, and it kind of makes sense as you put the pieces together. Although you can't see it 100% purely in the scriptural sense, but the fact that there's this kind of seems like it seems to be tied into the Essene hospitality kind of thing, probably is a reasonably large-sized room that they have that is there for in these kind of contexts. If it is, as often is the Christian tradition, it is also the house of John Mark, and they are a key family. And John Mark, every list of the 72 includes John Mark in it, who then becomes such a key kind of early missionary, although he causes a division between Paul and Barnabas. The thing I always flag is that division is caused at a time when there's a lot of tension around how you should incorporate Gentiles. So it's not surprising that on the first kind of real overt mission trip to recruit Gentiles, there might be division between two people who are both godly people as to how do you do this. But so you put all the bits together, and it's not an unreasonable proposition, and it has got an ancient, very, very long term. That's how it's understood, even to the degree that there is a building that has got churches built on it. But so far you can only excavate it back to about the 4th century. So would
that be the room also there where Jesus appeared to the 11, and then later Thomas?
I don't know. No, you see, that's why I touched on there are other houses as well. That there seem to be members of Jesus's family and John's family. And Jesus says in that context to John, "Take my mother," and he takes her to his house, i.e. to that location. So there are other places in Jerusalem that they have access to, but it's that one that seems to be more of the large space, which is, as I say, that is the consistent tradition that they are the same place. So, as I say, when I put these things together, you try and put them together in a way that makes a story that you can follow. But I'm very conscious that you're trying to create that story by putting not random guesses, but your best guesses based on evidence. But equally, that story might change as we uncover new things or discover new things. But actually, one of the things that used to frustrate me is if you read kind of more of the academic books, people are so unwilling to kind of come down on any conclusion that you get no sense of story or narrative. And actually, that's the normal way we as humans feel a story is how it progresses and builds. So I figured we need to be able to try and tell that story with some confidence, but with humility to say the details might change, but I doubt that it will change massively. It kind of seems to work like this, and you can see how one thing fits with another. But yeah,
I had a similar example a few years back. Jen and I have been to Ephesus twice.
Yeah.
And in Ephesus, there's a kind of memorial to John was buried there. And we kind of think, well, that's probably right. But also just up the road from Ephesus, there's the house of the Virgin Mary, which is a Catholic kind of area. Thinking, hang on, what would Mary be doing in Ephesus?
Yeah.
And if you take that verse literally, that Jesus shouted down from the cross, take this man to be your son, take this woman to be your mother, then maybe Mary did go with John to
exactly
Ephesus. It may be her house, and the Pope's been out to it and give it some kind of a validation, if you like. So things like that fascinate me.
Yeah, no, and I think that's often that, and there's always this slightly kind of level where some people say, is it circular? Is it that in the ancient world people concocted and said she died there because of that? But equally, it's something real, but the tendency very often in the modern world is to dismiss it unless you can prove it 100%. But I would say if you've got something that kind of holds together logically, that actually we can come at it and say, well, it's not an unreasonable assumption to start working from and see how it fits together. And if it turns out that there's something unequivocal turns up, we dig up an ossuary in Jerusalem that says this really was Jesus's mother and she really is buried exactly here, then it doesn't ruin everything, but we just amend our fully understanding to a degree, But it's a helpful question, Barry, because it highlights, as I say, I'm offering this with the kind of humility of actually, for me, as I've done this, the story has evolved. It changes probably every time you might nuance it or whatever. But fundamentally, we're trying to build towards something that actually you can see something real happened here, and it actually makes human sense. Because it's the kind of way people behave. And as I say, you know all about that, Barry, how people behave. And it's important for the story, if it's true, that people behave in the way that people really do behave, with all of their prejudices and preferences and fears and joys in the mix. Any other questions? It's nice to see there's a few more folks than when we started. So, as I've finally looked over at who's here. So, any other things that?
Thank you, Kristen, very much indeed. I hadn't realised the link of Malchus till this evening, just how he brings the authority from the high priest's house to the guard room. That was a lovely link I hadn't seen before.
Yeah, you see, now this is a good example, Richard, of what I'm trying to say is actually we get nuances in the gospel because we suddenly see him here, but actually it makes sense because actually otherwise how does Judas walk into the fort of Antonia and say, give me a couple of hundred soldiers, please? No one's going to listen to him. But he can go to the temple guard, but the temple guard won't listen to him either. But the temple guard will listen to Malchus, and the Roman soldiers will listen to the temple guard if the temple guard come and say, we need help with this. You don't have to go into the temple, it's out with the pilgrims, but there's a bit of trouble, you need to come with us. So suddenly we now have a mix, which actually we're told there's a mix of priests and guards and soldiers. They're all there, but you can see how they chain together, and that's what I mean as that's a very human level story. And you can see how that emerges from putting the Gospels together in a way that I think is it feels quite satisfying. So.